Gittin Daf Samachet Bet, Leadership and Regality. Ze haya chelki mikol amali. The experts in leadership often talk about the fact that to be a leader, you have to have followers, you have to be leading somebody. But that isn't always the case. That is true for leadership as a positional leadership. You're a leader because you occupy a position. You're a leader because you're leading a certain group of people. And in that case, that leadership is almost given to you extrinsically. It comes from an external source that makes you a leader. The people around you appoint you either formally or informally as their leader. But there's another type of leadership, which is innate leadership. Leadership which is a midah, which is a characteristic, which I call here regality, the ability to operate in a regal way, whether or not you have followers. And we'll see how we learn this idea out of our Gemara, which is a wondrous kind of science fiction story almost about Ashmedoi, the king of the Shadim. For lack of better words, the Shadim are ghosts or spirits, forces in the world that can take a human form. And Ashmedoi was the king of the ghosts, of the Shadim. And this piece of Gemara, there's a long story about how Shlomo needed Ashmedoi. Shlomo HaMelech needed Ashmedoi because Ashmedoi knew where the Shamir worm could be found. The Shamir was the worm that Shlomo needed to cut the bricks of the Beis HaMikdash without using metal. The Shamir could do that. So you need to get hold of Ashmedoi. There's a long story. This is where Benayahu ben Yehodaya comes up. I mentioned him last week. And Ashmedoi does a deal with Shlomo HaMelech. Shlomo HaMelech gives him the opportunity to hold his ring on which the Shem HaMefurush was. Ashmedoi was craving that ring. This might be one of the sources of the fables of the Lord of the Rings, where it comes from. It seems in every culture there's a story about this. So there's something in it. And Ashmedoi persuades him, says he'll give him the secrets of the Shamir worm if he lets him hold the ring. He gets hold of the ring, and with that he casts Shlomo HaMelech away hundreds of miles out. And Shlomo HaMelech is removed from his throne by Ashmedoi, who takes his place and masquerades as King Solomon. And it's on that the Gemara says, Al Hayishata Amar Shlomo. It's on that Shlomo said, Ma yitarun la'adam b'chol ha'malo she'ya'amol tachat hashemesh. What is the point of all the work that we put into our effort and effort that we put into our careers and into our status, into who we become? Look at this, I've given my whole life. I was raised to be king of Israel. And now the Gemara talks both here and in Sanhedrin and Daf Chof, there's more detail of this phase of Shlomo HaMelech's life, where Shlomo HaMelech finds himself literally going around from house to house asking for food. He had nothing, and nobody recognized him. So nobody believed him. They thought he was a crazy person. They didn't have internet at that time. They didn't have newspapers, so they didn't know what Shlomo HaMelech looked like. And he was all ragged and tired and dirty. And he was going from place to place just asking for help, and people were rejecting him and laughing at him. Imagine what that is for Shlomo HaMelech. And Shlomo then says, what's the purpose of all of this? When he says, this is all that's left for me from all my work. What is the zeh when he says this? This is what's left for me from all my work. What is he saying? What is he pointing at? We know from Chazal, whenever Tanakh uses the word v'zeh, it's something visible. You're pointing at an object. What is the object about which Shlomo HaMelech is talking? Rav and Shmuel had two different views on this. Chad amar maklo, v'chad amar gundo. One said it was his stick, and one said it was his cloak, his staff or his cloak. The Gemara in Sanhedrin is a little bit more detail of this. The Gemara says that in the beginning, Malach Shlomo ala Elyonim. Shlomo was king over the universe, including the higher forces. He understood how the forces of the world operated, and he was king over them. And then when he married many wives, he dropped a little bit in stature, and he was only the king of the physical world. And then he just became king of Israel. He was no longer king of the world. As it says, Ani Kohelet Hayiti Melech al Yisrael. I used to be the king of Israel. What does he mean, I used to be? So there was clearly a time when he wasn't even that. Then he was only king of Yerushalayim. The nation rejected him. And then he was only king of his bed. He surrounds his bed with 60 guardsmen because he feared the ghost. He feared the king of the Shadim. And then he only ruled over his own stick. Then Rav Shmuel also disagrees as to whether he recovered his throne or he didn't ever recover his throne. There's a machlokes about that. But what does this Gemara mean to us? Why is this Gemara important? What is the Gemara telling us, this particular part of the Gemara? And there's a very beautiful and important a piece in Rabbi Isaac Shiur. I mentioned Rabbi Isaac Shiur recently. Rabbi Isaac Shiur was a Rosh Yeshiva in Slobodka already in Europe, and then he miraculously got out of Europe. He was in Switzerland for medical treatment when the war broke out, got to Israel, and he, together with his son-in-law, Reb Mordechai Shulman, started the Slobodka Yeshiva in Bnei Brak. You were at the Slobodka Yeshiva in Bnei Brak on when? Thursday? Thursday night, you guys were there at Slobodka. So Rabbi Isaac Shiur and his son-in-law, Reb Mordechai Shulman, I never knew Rabbi Isaac Shiur. He died in the early 50s. But I did know Reb Mordechai Shulman. His son-in-law was the co-founder of Slobodka there. He came a few times to South Africa, and when these people used to come to South Africa, my father used to be very meticulous to make sure they spent time with us in our home, that they came for Shabbosim, they sat at our table, we ate with them, we lived with them, so we had an opportunity to get close to them as children. I'll never forget those occasions and these personalities. That was Reb Mordechai Shulman, and the other son-in-law was Reb Moshe Tukachinsky, who I did know very well. Reb Moshe Tukachinsky meant we spent many hours talking. And my son Moshe is named after the two Reb Moshes who had enormous influence on me at the end of their lives, Reb Moshe Feinstein and Reb Moshe Tukachinsky, the son-in-law of Rabbi Isaac Shiur. And this is the Rabbi Isaac Shiur who writes, Hinei mevuar kama nisga, let's read it inside because it's so important. Hinei mevuar kama nisgava hagadlut hapnimit shel Shlomo HaMelech. What this teaches us is how great the inner greatness of Shlomo was. People have greatness sometimes, but there can be outer greatness, which is also great, and there's inner greatness. Hashem nitaleh liot melech betiv'ei nafsho uve'imkei levavo. Shlomo HaMelech was a king in his inherent nature and the depths of his heart. That's where he was king. He wasn't a king because he sat in the White House or in Buckingham Palace. He was a king because of who he was at the depth of his heart. He carried the crown, not just with his head, but with the essence of who he was. He was a crown-bearing man. That's who he was. It wasn't a regality of overbearing on other people, of positional leadership, of having been appointed as a king. But it came from a greatness of inner soul and being. What happened when he lost his throne? That's the test. You see often when people have great positions, like they're president of the United States, and then always president. After 4 or 8 years, you're no longer president. And then you can't go back to being senator or governor or whatever. What do? You're an retired old man. Some of them get involved in things, some of them don't get that involved in things, but they lose a lot of that stature. They lose a lot of that presence. They're not who they used to be, because who they used to be was a function of the position given to them by the nation. It wasn't necessarily their own inner greatness that gave it to them. Not so with Shlomo. Even when he was knocking on doors, asking for food, never once did he lose his inner regality. All he had was his stick. That was all that was left over. The Maharal says it was the stick of his kingdom. It was his fan. It was a great stick, but it was just the stick. That's all he had, his staff. He was still a king. A king, because the Chazal uses a strange word. Malach al maklo. He ruled over his stick. What does that mean? You rule over a stick. How do you rule over a stick? That means he still functioned as a melech, as a king. And if it's inner kingship, who cares if you're in Yerushalayim or you're begging at the doors? Because initially his malchut was a character trait. It wasn't a position he was given. It wasn't a position he occupied. It was who he was in his essence. הנדודים בגלות תמיד היה מלך בעצמותו ומרתו, מי שבעצמות מלך הוא, הרי גם בלא כיסא מלכות, אינו מסיר מעל נפשו את עדי ממלוכו. A person who is inherently a king doesn't remove his regal garments and his regal uniform just because he doesn't have the office anymore. He's still a king, still acts as a king. et malato gedulato ha'atzmit, his inner independent greatness and worthwhileness as king. That's what Shlomo was. He was a king. What does it mean to be a king? Rabbi Isaac Shiur brings the Shiur Tshuva, where the Shiur Tshuva speaks on the psukim of Vatem Tiyuli Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh, and the Shiur Tshuva explains that it's a person who's Ve'eno min ha'ra'ui liot morah basar v'dam alehem ela l'shem shamayim. Human beings should not have fear of other human beings unless it's necessary for Shem Shamayim. But to go with what other people are saying, to have one's opinions formed by other people, to follow the trends of other people, to be governed by the viewpoints of other people, that's not Malchus. Malchus is the ability of Kili b'nei Yisrael avodim v'lo avadim la'avadim, to be enslaved to Hashem. That's Malchut. As it says, V'atem tiyuli mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh lashon kohanim adonim v'sarim. Kohanim means, it doesn't mean priest, you're not descended from Aaron, but to be an Adon and a Sar, to be a prince and masterful. That's what's required of the Jewish people, not just of the officers of the Jewish nation, not just of the Rabbonim and the Rosh Yeshivas of the Jewish nation, of every Jew. The whole nation is called a mamlacha. Mekolim yeshash goy mamlacha ki agoy mamlacha pirush atem tiyilui mamlacha shekula sarim. You are to be to me a nation made up of princes, all of you. Shelo yiyeh alechem ol basar v'dam. So that you're not being governed by other human beings, that you're independently minded and you're able to think the way Hashem wants you to think, and you're not pushed around by the viewpoints of other people. That's melucha. So when it says Shlomo HaMelech remained a king, it was not only in his bearing, but in his way of thinking, that it made no difference where he found himself, even in the most undermining of positions, he retained his inner sense of worth, his inner sense of value. At the end of the day, I'm a Ben Melech. I come from a Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. That's who I am, a Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. And I say every morning, Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam Shelo Asani Goy, that you didn't make me one of the other nations, you made me one of these people. That's what I say every morning, to remind myself who I am at my essence. And we have the most amazing stories, as you know, of Rabbi Chonon Wasserman, for example, when the Nazis knocked on the door, and I saw the house in which he was that day when the Nazis came. He was giving a shiur, and they were taking him out to take him to his murder. And he had such malchus that in that moment he could say to the Nazis, that's fine, just hold on a minute, I need to go upstairs and I need to put on my Shabbos clothes because I'm going to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. And apparently he went out, as the people who were there described, he went upstairs, he came down in his Shabbos garments with his pocket watch on his breast pocket over his waistcoat, and he looked magnificent, and he said, now I'm ready to go. And when they got to the fort where they were murdered, he said to the Nazis, hold on, not yet. And they all put down their guns. He said, first I need to teach my people how to give their lives al Kiddush Hashem. And he taught them from the Rambam, the Hilchos Kiddush Hashem. And he inspired them and he uplifted them. And then he said to the Nazis, now I've done my work, you can do yours. And they started shooting. But that there was such malchus that even the Nazis in that moment were held back by him. They had to obey him. And his position as a prisoner is about to go to his death. And he doesn't lose his malchus. People in Kelm talked about the fact how the Goyim in Kelm lined the streets to watch the Jews being marched to their death in Kelm. And they say it wasn't because they were party to it. There was a good relationship between the Jews of Kelm and the non-Jews of Kelm. It was to watch Reb Doniel lead them. And again, the eyewitness say he walked like a prince, leading his people to their death, to the mass graves which are there till this day. And there was malchus, people came to watch. And I've told you how in the tourist books of Kovno, there was, if you went on TripAdvisor in the 1930s and 1920s, you would find that one of the tourist things to see is to go to the Lesva Sayeya, which is the Liberty Boulevard, still today, beautiful boulevard of Kovno, and where every day at 3 o'clock the Kovno Rov would walk down the street with his stick, with his silver. They talk about the silver walking stick, and he would work with such regality that people would line the streets to see them, to see him take his daily walk. That regality, it doesn't matter whether you're a Rov of Kovna or Chas v'Sholom, you're going to your death, or you're knocking on doors asking for help, you don't lose regality. If you have regality in your blood, if you have regality in your DNA, you never lose that regality. And each of us has it. And again, sometimes we think when we talk about these things together and we learn these pieces, we think it's asking too much of us. This is for the Yechidei Segula, it's for certain people, not for all of us. No, it's for all of us. To at least aspire, as I said last week, to at least be on the spectrum, at least be moving towards that. Know what the Torah expects of us. Know our greatness. Know that Torah sees the regality in us. Hashem gave us that regality. We have that regality. That's why He gave us the Torah. But let's hold on to it. Let's be able to behave that way and to catch ourselves, at least be aware when we're not. When we're eating a falafel, walking down Achuzah Street or Chov Yafo or wherever it is, just be aware of the fact that at this moment I'm not exactly behaving like Shlomo HaMelech. At this I'm not actually behaving with regality. Just be aware of the fact. And as far as we can, at least when we're in shul, at least when we're learning Torah, at least at certain times, to make sure that we act and we live and we feel the regality that is the essential hallmark of the Jewish people.